When we talk about the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, we often think of one story. But really, it was fought on many fronts. And today, we're looking at two giants of that movement who walked two very different yet parallel paths. One, a global symbol from inside a prison cell, the other, a commander on the front lines. It really makes you think, right? How do you fight a revolution? Is it through quiet endurance, or is it through active armed struggle? Well, for decades, the anti-apartheid movement was defined by both, really personified by the contrasting roles of Nelson Mandela and Chris Hani. One was the icon, the other was the soldier. And this is the core of our story today. On one side, you've got Mandela. His long, brutal imprisonment turned him into what's called a secular icon, basically a non-religious figure who is revered all over the world. His weapon was his bravery and his powerful silence. And on the other side, Chris Hani, the commander, the man who became an idol to activists through direct armed struggle. So let's start with Mandela's path. Well, he was locked away on Robben Island, totally cut off from the world. Something amazing happened. His influence didn't just survive, it grew like exponentially, but in a very specific way. This quote from Professor Tom Lodge just nails it. It's this incredible paradox, isn't it? While Chris Hani and others were out in exile, planning and fighting, Mandela's decades behind bars were creating this incredibly powerful symbol of martyrdom. His silence, in a way, became louder than any speech he could have given, uniting the whole world against apartheid under his one name. So yeah, as the world was chanting Free Nelson Mandela, you have to remember a completely different kind of struggle was unfolding far, far away from those prison walls. This was the boots-on-the-ground military and political battle being led from outside South Africa. And this is where Chris Hani's story really takes center stage. See, he wasn't a symbol in silence. He was a soldier in exile, a hands-on leader who was actively shaping the armed resistance during those exact same years Mandela was in prison. And just look at this timeline. It shows you how fast he went from activist to soldier. He gets out of South Africa in '62, and just a year or two later, he's in the Soviet Union for serious military and political training. By '67, he's not just sitting around planning, he's on the ground, leading fighters in the famous Wankie campaign. This was a man of action, through and through. This image just says it all, doesn't it? He wasn't some politician in a fancy suit. He was a commander with his troops. As a leader in Umkhonto we Sizwe, that's the ANC's armed wing, he earned this incredible respect because he was one of them, sharing the exact same risks on the front lines. But to really get Chris Hani, you have to look beyond just the soldier. The man had two different kinds of courage. And you could argue that the second one, his moral courage, is what really defined his legacy, maybe even more than his bravery on the battlefield. Okay, so the Wankie campaign proved he was willing to risk his life, no question. But after that campaign failed, he did something that was, in its own way, even riskier. He turned his sharp, critical eye inwards on his own organization. And that led to a bombshell document known as the Hani Memorandum. Just listen to that opening line. The ANC in exile is in deep crisis as a result of which a rot has set in. Can you imagine the sheer guts it took to write that in 1969? He wasn't just pointing out a few small problems. He was accusing the leadership of corruption, of completely losing touch with the soldiers who were risking their lives every day. I mean, this was absolutely explosive. The memorandum was a devastating takedown of the leadership. He even called out the MK commander Joe Modise by name. He accused their own security department of hunting down internal critics instead of fighting the apartheid state. And what he demanded was a conference to clean house. For this act of incredible principle, Hani and the others who signed it were expelled. They were even threatened. That right there, that's moral courage. And it gives you a glimpse of the kind of leader South Africa would tragically lose. So for decades, these two paths run parallel. Then, after all that time, they finally converge. When Mandela is released, the icon and the commander meet, not as rivals, but as crucial allies, during one of the most dangerous and delicate moments in South Africa's history. And for a brief, incredibly critical period, the world saw them side by side. You had Mandela the statesman, bringing all that immense moral authority to the negotiating table. And you had Hani the popular commander, who was absolutely essential for convincing the young, militant activists to trust the peace process. And then, the absolute unthinkable happens. On an Easter weekend, with the country right on the edge of a new future, Chris Hani is murdered in his own driveway. The goal of the far-right assassins was sickeningly clear: ignite a full-blown civil war and destroy any hope for peace. And in that moment, with the country exploding in anger and grief, who steps up? It wasn't the sitting president. It was Nelson Mandela, who went on television to speak to the nation. He basically became the head of state, right then and there, using his iconic status to plead for calm and stop the country from tearing itself apart. And here is the ultimate tragic paradox of this whole story. The assassination, this horrible act designed to stop democracy dead in its tracks, actually had the opposite effect. The crisis forced everyone's hand. The sheer weight of the loss pushed the negotiators to finally set a firm date for the country's first ever democratic elections, locking South Africa onto the path to freedom. But Hani's death left a huge, gaping void. He was so popular, so connected to the people on the ground, that his absence would fundamentally reshape the future of the new South Africa, and it left behind these massive, unanswerable questions. 95%. Just let that number sink in for a second. 95%. What does that even represent? Well, it represents just how incredibly popular Chris Hani was inside his own movement. Get this. At the very first ANC conference held inside South Africa in 1991, Chris Hani got 95% of the vote for the National Executive Committee. That made him, without a doubt, the second most popular leader in the entire country. The only person ahead of him? Nelson Mandela himself. And that brings us to the final, haunting question. His death was called an incalculable loss for a reason. Many people believed he, not Thabo Mbeki, was the one who would have succeeded Mandela as president. So we're left to wonder, what if he had lived? How might the entire history of post-apartheid South Africa have been different? It's a question that still echoes today,